Absolutely. We don't know what's happened to Madeleine. We don't know who's taken her. Probably our best chance of finding her is identifying that person.
Please, please have the courage and confidence to come forward now and share that information with us. And you could unlock this whole case. So please, I mean, the general public have been fantastic, but please stay with us and come forward.
She didn't vanish. She was taken apart. That's not a sentence most people are ready to hear. It doesn't fit the bedtime version of the Madeleine McCann story, the one we've been told for years, of a mysterious abductor, a broken window, a sleeping child whisked into the night. But what if the real story didn't happen outside that apartment at all? What if the crime was surgical, not sudden, silent, not violent? What if Madeleine's disappearance wasn't a mystery to solve, but a horror to suppress? There are stains no bleach can clean, smells no air freshener can erase. And in apartment 5EA, the scent of death lingered on soft toys, in the wardrobe, behind the couch. The dogs found it. The blood confirmed it. But the world chose to look away. But if you want the truth, stay. Because now we go to where it all begins. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken window, no screams in the night. But there was blood. There was the scent of a decaying body. And there was a fridge that quietly disappeared. In the early hours of May 4th, 2007, the world was told that Madeleine McCann had vanished from her bed in apartment 5A of a Portuguese holiday resort. She was 3 years old. Her parents, Kate and Gerry McCann, both doctors, claimed to have left her and their 2 younger twins asleep while dining just meters away with friends. But when Kate checked on them around 10 p.m., Madeleine was gone. And just like that, the story of a missing child ignited a global manhunt. But what if she never left the apartment alive? What if the real story wasn't abduction, but dissection? Within months, British cadaver dogs were brought in. They didn't bark in the twins' room. They didn't alert at the entrance. But they did react in specific places, behind the living room sofa, in the wardrobe of the master bedroom, on Madeleine's cuddle cat toy, and, most chillingly, in the trunk of a rental car hired by the McCanns 24 days after her disappearance. These dogs didn't just pick up generic scent. They detected cadaverine, the chemical emitted only from human decomposition, and traces of human blood. The evidence wasn't noisy. It was quiet, clinical, and deeply damning. There's something forensic teams understand: cadaverine doesn't lie. It cannot be faked, and it doesn't linger without a corpse. The alerts led Portuguese police to one conclusion: Madeleine had died inside the apartment. But that wasn't the only clue left behind. Hidden in a report almost no one talks about was a detail many brushed off, until they read it twice. The fridge in the McCann's apartment had been replaced. No maintenance records. No statement from the resort. The original fridge was gone. The new one was in place shortly after the dogs reacted. That fact alone might mean nothing. But if we combine that with what we know, we see a biological footprint behind the sofa, not splattered, but deposited, as if a body had been laid there. Cadaver scent in the wardrobe suggests temporary containment, and that same scent on the child's cuddle toy means the dead body had been in contact with Madeleine's personal belongings. Now ask yourself, why would anyone change out a fridge unless it had been used for something that couldn't be cleaned? People love to think abduction is chaotic. That a stranger broke in, grabbed the child, and disappeared into the night. But this was silence. No damage. No noise. No DNA from outsiders. What was left behind wasn't the trace of panic. It was the trace of planning. A plan that might have involved medical knowledge. A plan that might have been executed not in a panic, but with precision. Gerry McCann was a cardiologist. David Payne, another member of the dinner party that night, was also a physician. There were a lot of doctors in the Tapa 7 group. They were trained in anesthesia. They knew anatomy. And then they admitted that drugs had been used. A word that was never appropriate for a 3-year-old. The forensic team found no signs of a violent struggle. However, they also noted that the amount of blood found was not enough to conclude that this was a case of blunt force trauma. In other words, this was not a homicide, but a surgical procedure. Some have speculated that Madeleine may have been deliberately sedated. But few have dared to ask the darker question of whether her body was compromised. Not to harm her, but to harvest her organs. In trading, timing is everything. Organs must be removed quickly, kept sterile, and transferred in a specific temperature range. What's needed? A skilled hand, access to equipment, a place to store the body, and a container to preserve what's taken. In this case, the fridge becomes more than suspicious. It becomes essential. The idea that something of a child's was taken away, and her body either concealed or destroyed, isn't speculation born of fantasy. It's drawn from what remains when all other theories fall apart. If she had been taken by a stranger, why was there blood inside the apartment and none outside? If she had wandered off, why was there cadaver scent in the closet? Why was no one caught on camera entering or leaving with a child? And why, more than anything, did the McCanns hire a rental car weeks after their daughter's disappearance and then leave the trunk tainted with cadaver scent? The car was a Renault Scenic. It wasn't rented until May 27th. By that point, if a body had been stored, decomposition would be significant. The only way to explain that scent in the car is if the body, or part of it, was transported long after death. And still, there's more. A full DNA analysis found that 15 out of 19 genetic markers from a sample in the trunk matched Madeleine. Yet the British Forensic Science Service declared the result inconclusive. Not disproven, just difficult to interpret. The report didn't clear the McCanns. It simply failed to close the door. Then there's the timeline. Madeleine is said to have disappeared at 9:30 p.m. By 10, Kate raises the alarm. Within 15 minutes, chaos begins. But if Madeleine had died hours earlier, all of that noise may have been theater. If a surgical operation had already taken place, if a plan had already gone wrong or been carried out, then the only thing left was to simulate panic, draw attention away, and let the world believe in a villain who never existed. In every other missing child case, the pattern is different. Doors are kicked in. Families scream. Parents collapse on live TV. But Gerry McCann. He played tennis just days later. He smiled on camera. He joked with friends. And all the while, the fridge was gone, the car was tainted, and the apartment was cleaned. What if Madeleine never left apartment 5A alive? What if she didn't disappear, but was disassembled? That question may be too much for many to face. But as the physical evidence fades, it remains the only one that still fits. And if there was a buyer, if an organ was meant for someone who never arrived in time, then perhaps that's why Gerry had to drive alone late that night. Perhaps that's why, in the next part of this story, we'll follow the one route the police never fully explained, the untraceable, unspoken journey of a father in the dark. Because where Madeleine went may not be a place. It may be many places. He drove alone that night. No one knew where he went. No one could trace the route. But the timing was off, and the silence surrounding it was louder than anything he said in interviews. Gerry McCann's unexplained drive, sometime after the initial chaos of May 3rd, remains one of the most examined events in the case. The police didn't press it. The media didn't question it. But what if that was the moment everything changed? 24 days after Madeleine was reported missing, the McCanns rented a Renault Scenic. It was a family-sized vehicle, ordinary, forgettable. But that car would later test positive for cadaver scent in the trunk. Not days after the disappearance. Not during some frantic search. Weeks later. And the scent wasn't faint. It was strong enough to alert a highly trained British cadaver dog. The same scent that had earlier been found on Madeleine's toy, on her parents' bedroom floor, and in the closet. Now it was in the car. The question was no longer whether something had been transported. It was when and why. There was no official reason why the McCanns needed that car. Their friends had vehicles. Taxis were everywhere in Praia da Luz, but they rented the Scenic anyway, and shortly after that, witnesses reported seeing Gerry taking late night drives alone, without explanation. Some say he was out looking for Madeleine. But there were no confirmed routes, no official search logs, and most critically, No witnesses who saw him with a flashlight, asking questions, or knocking on doors. He wasn't searching. He was disappearing. What do you transport in the trunk of a car, weeks after your child goes missing? What smells of death and matches her DNA? What makes you drive long enough and far enough that you don't come back with answers, but you come back looking hollow? In Portugal, the theory that Madeleine's body had been moved was quietly accepted by local investigators early on. But moved to where? And for what purpose? One line of inquiry, buried deep in Portuguese police reports, suggested a chilling possibility. The body may not have been complete. This is where everything turns. If the body had been stored after death, whether whole or not, then the need for refrigeration becomes urgent. That takes us back to the missing fridge. But storage is only half the equation. The other half is transaction. There's a reason why the trade is one of the most lucrative black market operations in the world. And there's a reason why it rarely gets prosecuted. Because it requires silence at every level, medical, legal, and political. Could the drive have been a meeting? A delivery? A delayed hand, off after something had already gone wrong? It's a grim possibility. But then again, so is everything else in this case. And Gerry wasn't just taking solo drives. According to various witness statements, there were also periods of time, late at night, where no one in the group could confidently say where he was. Phones were off. GPS was never checked. His phone, notably, connected to a different cell tower than Kate's on at least one key occasion during that week. Why the separation? In a small town like Praia da Luz, distances are short. You can drive to the next village in under 10 minutes. You can reach the Spanish border in a few hours. You can find remote, unpatrolled stretches of forest or coast within 30 kilometers. And if you're carrying something you don't want found, the timing matters more than the destination. If that sounds like fiction, remember this. The only real explanation ever offered for Gerry's solo drives is that he needed air. The same man who told the world his daughter had been taken from her bed just days earlier. The same man who appeared calm, collected, and eerily composed. The same man whose smile on the resort balcony, captured in candid footage, looked more like relief than grief. People grieve in strange ways, but they don't drive away in the middle of the night, leaving no record, unless there's something they can't do in daylight. And still, no one asks. What was in the trunk? What or who? The police never searched the car until much later. By then, the trail had gone cold. DNA had degraded, but the cadaver scent remained, and it told a story that no press conference could erase. If Gerry was transporting something once alive, it didn't belong in that car. And it didn't belong in the ground either. Because when bodies are buried, people ask questions. When they vanish in pieces, no one even knows where to start. And so we follow him now. Not as a grieving father, but as a man on a route only he understood. Through the dark, down unnamed roads, with something in the back seat that would never make it home. Where did he go? The better question might be, what did he bring back? Data later revealed that on the night of May 3rd and into the early morning of May 4th, his mobile phone connected to a cell tower located outside the expected range of the Ocean Club Resort. Not just once, but for a sustained window of time. This wasn't a dropped call or a momentary glitch. It was relocation. A signal drifting far enough to suggest Gerry wasn't where he said he was. Kate's phone stayed within the area. Gerry's didn't. Even more troubling, there was a 30-minute phone call placed to a number that has never been publicly identified. A number that was not part of the Tapas group, not a family member, not media, not police. The call occurred shortly after Madeleine was declared missing and long before the first interviews were scheduled. No transcript was released. No summary offered. And when asked about it, Gerry said nothing. Why would a father, during the most chaotic hours of his life, spend 30 minutes on a call he never reported? To whom was he speaking, while his daughter was supposedly missing, while police were being alerted, while the resort was swarming with concern? These are not gaps. They are red flags. And then there's the question of access. Praia da Luz is a sleepy town, but well-connected. A driver can reach Portimao in under 30 minutes, Seville in 3 hours, or even cross the Spanish border by dawn. Gerry had access to a vehicle with no tracking, a phone with no oversight, and a press operation so tightly controlled that journalists were kept at bay unless approved by his PR team. While the rest of the world focused on posters and candlelight vigils, he had already moved into a different phase. Logistics. The Portuguese police suspected something very early on. According to leaked notes, they believed the child had died in the apartment and that a body had been moved in a vehicle rented later. But the motive was still missing. Why would a respected doctor and father of 3 risk everything, unless he had already lost everything and was trying to cover the scale of it? Here's what we know about black market trade. It thrives on discretion, speed, and denial. There is no receipt, no follow-up, only a briefcase, a cooler, a location, and a signature that never appears on paper. Was Gerry's late-night drive part of a rescheduled exchange? Was the 30-minute phone call about payment, location, or delay? Was the body already partially handled before Madeleine was even reported missing? One investigator, speaking off record, described the timeline as too neat to be real. The frantic discovery, the shouts, the rushed calls to friends and police, all happening in less than 15 minutes. But in the hours before that, according to other witnesses, the group was unusually calm. Multiple staff members at the Ocean Club noted that Gerry and Kate appeared composed, even while others in the group showed visible signs of distress. Why the composure? Unless what had to be done was already done? The rental car's trunk wasn't just contaminated by cadaver scent. It also showed signs of fluid seepage, which was noted but never tested further. When samples were taken, a partial DNA match to Madeleine was found, and yet the British forensic team concluded the result was not definitive. Still, it didn't exonerate anyone. It simply left room for ambiguity, a gift to anyone hoping for the trail to fade. And the trail did fade. But not before the McCanns received immediate diplomatic support, unusual legal protections, and press coverage that shifted from suspicion to sympathy almost overnight. The same media that ran headlines like, "Did the parents do it?" weeks earlier, suddenly rebranded them as Britain's grieving heroes. What changed? Some believe it was political pressure. Others say it was strategic funding. But a more grounded answer lies in something colder. Time. Every hour that passed without a body, without a confession, without a definitive trace, meant the possibility of resolution slipped further away. The drive Gerry took that night wasn't just a detour. It was a countdown. Once he returned, the real search could begin. Because whatever needed to be moved, stored, or handed off was already gone. We don't know where he drove. We don't know who was waiting. But we do know what was never found. And now, nearly 2 decades later, we're left asking the same questions the police stopped asking long ago. What was in the trunk? Why did he drive alone? Who did he call? And what was he delivering? Because it's possible the truth wasn't hidden in darkness. It was driven straight through it. They weren't strangers. They were friends, doctors, parents, people who shared dinners, laughter, and vacations. But sometimes, fractures don't start on the day tragedy strikes. They form quietly, long before. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, that fracture may have been visible to someone. If only the world had listened. Catherine Gasper tried to speak. What she remembered wasn't about Praia da Luz. It wasn't about my third. It was about something that had happened years earlier. Something that unsettled her so deeply that it stayed buried until Madeleine disappeared. When it did, her memory surfaced with alarming clarity, and what she recalled wasn't an accident. It was a warning. According to Catherine, during a family holiday in Majorca, in either 2005 or 2006, she and her husband Arul were among a group of friends, including the McCanns and another couple, David and Fiona Payne. They were all doctors, all part of the same social circle. At one point during the vacation, David Payne had a conversation with Gerry McCann. Catherine couldn't remember the exact words, but she remembered the gesture. David made a movement with his hand, near his mouth, mimicking a sexual act, then pointed downward toward the floor, where Madeleine was supposed to be. Catherine didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She froze. There are moments that scratch the back of your mind years later. This was one of them. It wasn't the kind of joke doctors make. It wasn't something to brush off. In her own words, she said she felt extremely uncomfortable and disturbed by what she saw the moment passed. No one else brought it up, but she never forgot. Her husband, Arul, later confirmed that Catherine had told him about the incident at the time. He didn't witness it himself, but he remembered how shaken she had been. And when news of Madeleine's disappearance broke in 2007, it came flooding back. They reported it, quietly, carefully, to the Leicestershire police in a formal witness statement. The date was May 16, 2007, barely 2 weeks after Madeleine vanished. But what happened next raised more questions than answers. The statement wasn't acted on. It was logged, transferred, and then buried. No independent investigation was launched into David Payne. No follow-up interview. No warning to social services. No contact with the Portuguese authorities. Not until months later, when Portuguese police requested full documentation. By the time the statement reached them, it was almost too late. The media storm had fully crowned the McCanns as victims, and any alternate theory had been drowned out by headlines and sympathy. Why would British police sit on a statement like that? A doctor describes a scene where a colleague misbehaved with a child. The child later went missing. Was it a failure of judgment? Or was someone protecting the circle? The Leicestershire police have never provided a full explanation. Freedom of information requests, filed in the years after, were repeatedly deflected. One line from their correspondence stands out. All material concerning the McCann case has been transferred to Operation Grange. A convenient wall. A bureaucratic dead end. And yet, in the raw files of the original Portuguese investigation, the GASPER'S statement remained, untouched, undisputed, unexplored. But it gets worse. Around the same time as the Majorca vacation, David Payne's name appears in a different kind of file, an internal NHS inquiry in the UK, where an unnamed staff member raised concerns about his behavior around child patients. Nothing was proven. No charges were brought. But the whispers were there. When later asked if David Payne had ever been investigated for inappropriate conduct, the answer was evasive. No formal disciplinary action was recorded. Not the same as no concern. Now place that next to another statement from Yvonne Martin, a British child protection specialist who happened to be vacationing in Praia da Luz at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. On the morning of May 4th, she voluntarily approached the McCanns, identifying herself as a social worker. She claimed she immediately recognized David Payne, but couldn't place where. She believed she had seen him in the context of a previous child protection case in the UK. She didn't accuse him. But she was alarmed enough to notify the Portuguese police, and later the Leicestershire authorities. Her concerns were documented, and, again, nothing happened. So what do we make of this? A mother sees a doctor making an inappropriate gesture toward her friend's toddler. Years later, that child goes missing. Another expert believes she met the man in a case involving children. And yet, in the midst of a global investigation, no one dares to say the name David Payne out loud. Why? Perhaps it has something to do with the structure of the group. David Payne wasn't just a friend. He was close to both Gerry and Kate. He arranged the Ocean Club trip. He was one of the first to speak to the police. And crucially, he was the last person outside the family to see Madeleine alive. During a short visit to the apartment, while Kate was bathing the kids and Gerry was out playing tennis. That visit, oddly enough, is mentioned in only a few interviews. And when pressed for details, David struggled to remember what Madeleine was wearing, what she was doing, what was said. It was vague, detached. And yet, when Kate was later asked about that evening, she said Payne had come by, seen the children, and said how beautiful and calm they looked. That phrasing, so specific, did not match the tone of someone casually passing through. Could David Payne have been more involved than anyone admitted? And more than that, could Gerry McCann have tolerated it? Catherine GASPER'S testimony strongly suggests Gerry was part of the conversation during the disturbing gesture. He didn't recoil. He didn't confront. If anything, his reaction was ambiguous, or worse, indifferent. And that brings us to the heart of the fracture. What if Madelein's disappearance didn't just involve outside forces, but internal ones? What if the Tapas group, praised for their solidarity, was actually bound by silence, not innocence? The holiday in Majorca wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a pattern. A tightly knit circle of medical professionals, vacationing together with children, always in private resorts. Always in countries with limited cross-border oversight. If this were any other profession, that might mean nothing. But when the same individuals are connected to missing children, to disturbing gestures, to hushed-up reports, it begins to form something else entirely. A network. Not necessarily of criminals, but of people with secrets. Could Madeleine's fate have been sealed not in Portugal, but years earlier, when no one paid attention to a hand gesture, or a mother's unease? And if someone within that circle had an agenda, medical, sexual, or transactional, who would stop them? You can ignore a conversation. You can explain away a gesture. But an official record, once created, shouldn't disappear. And yet, somehow, that's exactly what seems to have happened. After Catherine Gasper made her statement, and after social worker Yvonne Martin voiced her concerns, everything should have triggered a formal response. In the UK, allegations of potential risk to children, especially involving medical professionals, are typically logged into child protection systems. These systems, maintained by local police forces and social service departments, are designed to be durable, traceable, and legally required. They form a protective web, so that if a child is at risk, the system knows it. In this case, that system should have held a file. One for David Payne. One for Gerry McCann. Because when two separate witnesses, one of them a registered social worker, raised red flags involving the same individuals, protocol demanded it. And according to internal sources, those files did exist, briefly. Reports submitted in 2007 indicate that Leicestershire police did log and review the statements from both the GASPER'S and Yvonne Martin, categorizing them under child protection concerns. These statements were meant to be stored in the force's intelligence database, and, under UK safeguarding law, should have triggered preliminary inquiries, at the very least, internal notes or alerts shared with relevant agencies. But when Freedom of Information requests were filed in later years, asking about the existence of any child protection files linked to David Payne or Gerry McCann, the response was chilling. No information is held. Not, it cannot be disclosed. Not, it is exempt under legal privilege. But, not held. As if the records had never existed at all. Multiple FOI requests from different parties produced identical answers. When pressed further, Leicestershire Police referred all inquiries to Operation Grange. Operation Grange, in turn, refused to comment on files generated by other jurisdictions. The silence wasn't just administrative. It felt strategic. This is where the story begins to take shape, not as a tale of incompetence, but of possible obstruction. To delete a child protection file from a UK police database is not simple. It requires credentials, authorization, and a reason. These records are among the most sensitive data handled by law enforcement, shielded by privacy laws, but retained for decades because of their potential importance in future investigations. They are not deleted lightly. They are especially not deleted during an active international investigation involving a missing child. So if the records aren't there, the question is no longer, where are they? The question becomes, who deleted them, and why? One theory, voiced by a former officer familiar with Leicestershire safeguarding protocol, suggests that the deletion may have been initiated after external consultation. In other words, after a request by a third party. Who would make such a request? The Metropolitan Police, a legal team representing the McCanns, a government official seeking to minimize reputational damage. All possibilities, none confirmed. But let's consider motive. In 2007, The UK government took an unusually direct role in the Madeleine McCann case. Within hours of her disappearance, the Foreign Office intervened, assigning consular staff to the McCanns and facilitating their media communications. A government-backed PR officer, Clarence Mitchell, was installed to manage their image. These moves were unprecedented. Other families of missing children received no such support. But the McCanns weren't ordinary citizens, they were doctors, professional, educated, media savvy, and, some suspect, politically connected. Would the deletion of sensitive files be justifiable as an attempt to avoid distraction, to protect the integrity of an investigation? If so, it would be a stunning overreach, one that undermines the very purpose of child protection structures. Because a deleted file doesn't just erase data, it erases accountability. And that's where the risk lies. Because the moment you destroy a record, you destroy the ability for independent review, for future investigators to connect dots, for justice to remain open. There's also the timing. Most FOI denials referencing a lack of data came after Operation Grange was announced in 2011, and after the McCanns had filed multiple successful defamation suits against media outlets. It was a period in which the narrative began to harden, shifting the McCanns from controversial figures to untouchable victims. As the press softened its tone, so too did institutional inquiries, and anything that hinted at prior warnings or internal red flags quietly removed from sight. And so we're left with a deeply unsettling possibility that the UK's safeguarding system, designed to protect vulnerable children, was overridden to shield reputations, not necessarily because of guilt, but because of power. David Payne was never arrested. He was never charged. But that's not the point. The system doesn't require proof of guilt to flag concern. It only requires that someone says, "This doesn't feel right." And multiple people did. The files should still exist. The fact that they don't is not a coincidence, it's a decision. A decision made, perhaps, by people who believed the bigger picture was more important than a series of uncomfortable patterns, perhaps by individuals in law enforcement or government who felt that suggesting impropriety within the McCann's circle would derail the larger operation. Or perhaps by people who knew exactly what they were doing, erasing history before it could become evidence. And this brings us to a darker reflection, that in certain cases, child protection becomes child politics. Because when the people in question are not poor, not vulnerable, not marginalized, but elite, credentialed, and legally insulated, then the machinery built to protect the innocent may be turned inward, shielding power instead of probing it. So now, nearly 2 decades later, we are left asking the quietest, most dangerous question of all. Who decided that some truths weren't worth keeping? And if those truths had remained, would we still be searching for a girl the system may have failed before she ever disappeared? The records were gone, but their behavior remained. And sometimes, the things people choose to do, when no one's looking, say more than any file ever could. Just days after Madelein's disappearance, while media trucks crowded the streets of Praia da Luz and international coverage was still building momentum, Gerry McCann was photographed smiling, wide, unguarded, even joyful, on the balcony of his resort apartment. Not a weak smile, not a forced grimace, a laugh, a full-bodied, relaxed laugh, surrounded by friends, with the sun overhead and a drink in hand. Nearby, children played, tapas were served, cameras clicked, and the man who had just told the world he'd lost his daughter forever looked remarkably at ease. That image would become infamous. It was followed closely by another story, quietly picked up by British tabloids, that Gerry had resumed playing tennis at the Ocean Club just a few days after Madeleine vanished. Not a therapeutic walk or a stress-relieving jog, but a proper, scheduled match with friends, rackets, and all. No press conference that day. No search party. Just leisure. A man in tennis whites, on court, swinging calmly at the ball, as if he hadn't just buried the world's sympathy under a missing person poster. For many, this was the moment something cracked. In high-profile cases, emotions are watched as closely as evidence. People expect tears, anguish, the visible collapse of a parent under the weight of uncertainty. They expect sleepless nights, televised pleas, frantic movement. They expect humanity. But what the world saw was a group of adults who did not behave like grieving families. They ate together every night, even after the event. They drank wine. They laughed, on occasion. They maintained routines. A few even took brief walks to the beach. And all the while, the seat at the children's table remained one chair short. These weren't private moments accidentally caught. Some of them were public. And while the McCann's spokesperson would later claim that the tennis match and smiling photos were taken out of context, the damage had been done. People had seen it, and they remembered. So what was the context? Psychologists later weighed in. Some said the McCanns and their friends were experiencing dissociative coping, a mental mechanism in which the body protects itself from trauma by behaving normally, clinging to habits. Others said it was adaptive behavior, that continuing rituals like dinner or light exercise could preserve sanity during an ongoing crisis. But there's a line between coping and detachment, because even coping has a pulse. It breaks. It wavers. It fails, eventually. And yet, according to multiple staff members at the resort, not a single member of the tapas group broke down in public during the first week. Not one required medical attention for shock. No one canceled dinner reservations. No one left early. No one fell apart. Instead, they organized, appointed media contacts, agreed on timelines, controlled interviews, declined questions, hired lawyers. And when a journalist asked Gerry weeks later how he was holding up, his answer was striking. We're trying to get back to normal. At a time when most parents would be unable to eat, sleep, or even breathe without panic, Gerry wanted to get back to normal, and the rest of the group seemed to agree. So we ask, what is it they were coping with? Because this was not the response to an open-ended tragedy. It looked more like the reaction to a resolved one. One that didn't require frantic action anymore. One that no longer called for searching, only surviving. And then there's the issue of control. From the very beginning, the McCanns kept tight command over their messaging. Press conferences were brief, scripted. Media appearances were selective. Friends gave near identical statements. Any deviation from the official narrative, whether from witnesses or journalists, was quickly challenged or legally threatened. When Portuguese police released inconsistencies in testimonies, the group denied them. When outsiders asked too many questions, access was revoked. It was crisis management, not mourning. And this need for control extended beyond words. Reports suggest that some resort staff were advised not to speak to reporters, that guests who raised concerns were ignored, and that the tapas group declined to participate in reenactments requested by investigators. There was no chaos in their camp, no open conflict, just strategy. Even in the early hours after Madeleine was declared missing, witnesses recall an eerie calm. Staff who were present described Kate pacing the room, repeating the phrase, "They've taken her," while Gerry spoke on the phone, not with police, but with family and legal contacts. There were no raised voices, no smashed furniture, no raw panic, only control. And yet, something else was missing too. Not sadness, not fear, but grief in its truest form. That uncontrolled, visceral collapse that comes when someone you love is gone, and you don't know why. It doesn't make room for strategy or tennis matches, which is what made the group's behavior so unusual. It wasn't just Gerry. It was all of them. Jane Tanner, Russell O'Brien, Fiona and David Payne. None of them cracked in front of press. None of them veered from the collective line. None of them reportedly suffered a breakdown severe enough to interrupt the trip. It was unity. Synchronized. Even more unsettling. None of them, to this day, have publicly challenged the official timeline. Not even to express doubt. Not even to say, "I wish we'd done things differently." For a group of doctors and parents, trained to think critically, this uniformity is unnatural. Unless, of course, the real story was never about confusion. Unless what we were seeing wasn't a mystery, but a cover. because people who know what happened don't fall apart. They keep moving. And sometimes, they even play tennis. There's a difference between losing someone and letting them go. And in the quiet moments before tragedy, it's often the things left unsaid that speak the loudest. In her own published memoir, Madeleine, Our Daughter's Disappearance and the Continuing Search for Her, Kate McCann reveals glimpses of her inner world before May 3rd. Amid the grief and retrospection, one detail stands out, not because it was meant to shock, but because it slipped through the narrative almost unnoticed. According to relatives quoted in several interviews, and supported by comments reflected in Kate's own writing, Kate had, at one point before the holiday, expressed that she couldn't cope with Madeleine's behavior. In private conversations, she allegedly mentioned that raising Madeleine was becoming too much for her emotionally. The idea of sending her daughter to stay with relatives, even temporarily, was floated, not as punishment, but as a form of relief. These admissions were framed as exhaustion, parental burnout, a mother overwhelmed by a precocious child and the demands of juggling twins, a full-time career, and public expectations. To some, these feelings were entirely human, honest, relatable. But in the context of what came next, they sound different, not confessional, but predictive. What kind of emotional state must a parent reach to consider handing off their child, not due to abuse or danger, but because the presence of the child herself was too difficult? Kate has described Madeleine as spirited, willful, intense, the kind of child who demanded attention, who asked questions, who noticed things. And while many parents might chuckle and say, "She's a handful," Kate's tone was different. There was something sharper beneath it. A subtle edge. A wariness not just of motherhood, but of that particular child. This isn't evidence. But it is context. Because when a person reaches the point of emotional detachment, where the idea of letting a child go becomes thinkable, it alters how we view their reactions later. Their decisions, their silences. It's not uncommon for overwhelmed parents to fantasize about escape. But for most, it's fleeting. A thought dismissed the moment it arrives. Kate's comments suggest something deeper. A sustained strain, one that may have grown over time. And when combined with the pressure of vacationing with other families, with constant exposure to comparison, judgment, and suppressed resentment, it becomes a dangerous psychological cocktail. So we ask the uncomfortable question. Did something break? Was there a moment, an afternoon, a fight, a scream, where everything she had resisted feeling came rushing forward? Where a second of impulsive action led to a permanent consequence? Or was it not impulsive at all? If someone had already considered letting their child go, even temporarily, could that idea, in the wrong context, become something more drastic, more final? Especially in an environment filled with medical knowledge, closed social circles, and the silent presence of others who may have known too much and said too little. We can't know. But the shadows of those words, "I couldn't cope with her," linger, not as confessions, but as cracks in the facade. Because when you tell the world your child was everything to you, and someone quietly remembers that you once considered sending her away, the world starts to wonder which version was true. And whether, when the final moment came, Kate wasn't just overcome with panic, but with relief. What do you do after a child vanishes when you've searched, pleaded, and cried in front of the world's cameras, but no answers come? For the McCanns, the answer was, you start a fund. 12 days after Madeleine's disappearance, on May 15, 2007, Kate and Gerry McCann launched what the media initially called a charitable initiative to help find their daughter. It was urgent, emotional, and, in the eyes of many, noble. But beneath the emotion lay something unexpected. Madeleine's fund, leaving no stone unturned Lonnied, was not a charity. It was a private limited company. That distinction matters more than most realize. In the UK, charities are subject to strict transparency requirements. They must publish detailed annual reports. They must be governed by independent trustees. And, crucially, they must use donated funds solely for charitable purposes, defined by law. But the McCanns Fund didn't fall under those rules. Because UK law doesn't allow charitable status for causes focused exclusively on one individual, Madelein's fund was registered as a business entity, not a charity. This gave Kate and Gerry, and their small inner circle, total control over its operations. They became directors, decision-makers, gatekeepers of millions, and the money flowed in quickly. In just the first year, the fund raised nearly £1.85 million from public donations, celebrity endorsements, and media-backed appeals. Supporters from around the world believed they were helping a desperate family fund private investigators maintain public awareness and chase down every possible lead. But that's not where all the money went. From its very inception, the fund's spending pattern raised eyebrows. Among the earliest disclosures was the revelation that the fund was being used to pay £2,000 per month toward the McCanns' home mortgage in Rothley, Leicestershire. The justification: that both parents had taken unpaid leave from work to focus on the search. Ethically, this became the first crack. Donors believed they were funding a mission, not a lifestyle. And while the McCanns eventually promised to stop using the fund for personal expenses after being declared official suspects in Portugal, argudos, the damage was done. The line between tragedy and income had blurred. Things didn't improve from there. Over the next 5 years, the fund spent large sums not just on investigation, but on reputation management, PR firms, legal teams, media advisors. In one instance, the fund reportedly covered more than £12,000 in fees for a government-trained media consultant, Clarence Mitchell, whose job wasn't to find Madeleine, but to manage the press. Then came the lawsuits. In 2008, the McCanns sued Express newspapers for defamation and won £505,000 in damages. In 2013, they won another £55,000 from the Sunday Times. That money didn't go to victim support. It was funneled directly back into the fund. The cycle had begun. Public donations funded legal battles, which resulted in settlements, which returned to the fund, which paid for more lawyers. At some point, finding Madeleine no longer appeared to be the primary focus. That became clearer when the fund hired Metodo 3, a private detective agency based in Spain, for a 10-month contract worth £25,000. The firm made bold promises: Madeleine would be found by Christmas. They claimed to have underworld connections, secret sources, and access no one else had. None of it led anywhere, not a single credible lead, no arrests, no sightings, just rumors. The contract was quietly terminated. £250,000, gone. Critics called it reckless. Donors called it betrayal. Yet the fund kept operating. As the years went on, the financial reporting became less detailed. Vague terms like campaign management and support expenses replaced clear line items. Quarterly updates vanished. The board remained entirely internal, consisting of family members, close friends, and longtime allies like businessman Brian Kennedy and solicitor Edward Smethurst. No outside auditors. No public oversight. When pressed in interviews, the McCanns insisted the fund was fully accountable. But they never published itemized spending reports. And when journalists requested clarity, especially on whether funds were being set aside for legal battles or public relations, the responses were evasive. Meanwhile, the case itself had gone cold. By 2011, with no major breakthroughs and waning public attention, the UK government launched Operation Grange, a metropolitan police review of the case. This was a state-funded investigation costing over £13 million to date. Yet while government money flowed into examining leads, the fund remained active. And while the police were busy, the fund was busy too, suing Goncalo Amaral, the former Portuguese detective who had published a book, The Truth of the Lied, suggesting Madeleine had died in the apartment and that the McCanns had staged a cover-up. That lawsuit failed, but not before the fund spent thousands in legal fees trying to suppress dissenting voices. Donors, many of whom believed their money was being used to chase new leads, were unknowingly bankrolling an international libel war. So the question emerges, was the fund a search engine or a shield? By 2024, the answer seemed clearer. Nearly £900,000 remained in the fund's account, despite no major developments in years. No confirmed sightings. No arrests. No concrete evidence. The money sat idle, unallocated, quietly earning interest. The McCanns stated that if Madeleine was ever found, or declared deceased, the fund would be used to help other missing children. But that plan was never codified. No timeline. No guidelines. No actual assistance offered to other families. Not a single other missing child's case is known to have received help from the fund. Instead, it became a financial monument. A structure built in crisis, preserved through loyalty, and maintained long after the mission lost momentum. At some point, the question stopped being, "Where is Madeleine?" It became, "What is this fund really for? Was it created to help find a child, or to protect the image of those who lost her? Was it about truth, or about control?" To many, the McCanns remained sympathetic figures, parents who suffered unimaginable pain, vilified by tabloids and haunted by uncertainty. But to others, the fund represents something darker. A cautionary tale about how tragedy, money, and media confuse into something opaque. Something untouchable. Something that no longer needs answers, just balance sheets. And when grief turns into administration, when donations become budgets, and when justice becomes a trademark, then we are no longer talking about loss. We are talking about business. In the heart of every theory about Madeleine's disappearance lies one brutal question that few dare to ask out loud. What if this wasn't random? What if she was chosen, not by chance, not by opportunity, but by design? To explore that possibility, we need to look not at who Madeleine was, but at who surrounded her. Not strangers, not local criminals, but professionals, doctors. Gerry McCann was a consultant cardiologist, highly trained, acquainted with complex anatomy, sterile technique, and the fragility of life. David Payne, too, was a physician working in trauma and emergency medicine. This wasn't a group of tourists with vague scientific knowledge. These were people who understood the human body, medical logistics, pharmacology, and how systems can be worked from the inside. In the days following Madeleine's disappearance, there was speculation that perhaps sedatives had been used. Perhaps something went wrong. Perhaps she died accidentally. But what if nothing went wrong? What if everything went according to plan? A plan that had begun long before the McCanns boarded that plane to Portugal. Here's what we know. Illicit trafficking is all about timing, compliance, and control. It's a brutal form of trafficking that relies on secrecy, speed, and above all, access. Access to patients. Access to storage. Access to borderless medical networks. And who better to operate within such a system than doctors? In Europe, a functioning black market for organs doesn't function like in Hollywood. It's not a van in the woods. It's hidden within hospitals, private clinics, and gray, zoned institutions. It operates through contacts in pathology, in transport, in customs. And for it to work, the donors can't just be available. They must be screened, selected. Which brings us back to Madeleine, blonde, white, healthy, young, from a family with excellent medical records, easy to profile, easy to evaluate. Could she have been, before anything else, a match? It's disturbing, but not impossible. Especially if someone had been planning long before arrival. Let's consider this. All of the Tapas group stayed in apartments near each other. All of them had young children. And yet, only Madeleine slept in a room farthest from her parents, with windows facing the street. Only her apartment was accessed directly from the car park. Only her disappearance triggered a media storm of this magnitude. Why her? Now look closer. Retrieving biological material is often thought of as messy, but it doesn't have to be, especially for professionals. Retrieving it can be done with minimal time, especially after death, if the body is properly cooled and preserved. The time between death and preservation is crucial. The amount of time organs must be cooled to maintain viability. This can range from 4 to 24 hours, depending on the type of organ. Which is why storage matters. A functioning fridge in a holiday apartment, not sufficient. But a replacement fridge, newly installed, with the original untraceable, that becomes suspicious. A medical team, especially one with background in trauma and transplant logistics, would know exactly how to store tissue safely until transport. But how would it leave Portugal? Here's where it gets more intricate. Portugal is part of the Schengen area, meaning no passport control between most European countries. If someone had contacts in private aviation or medical courier services, it could be transported swiftly, disguised as samples, transplants, or medical specimens. If the recipient was already waiting in another country, Spain, France, Germany, the delivery could be made in under 6 hours. Now imagine if the courier wasn't a stranger, but someone with medical credentials, someone with clearance, someone who knew the timing, the refrigeration requirements, the paperwork tricks. In that context, Madelein's body wasn't the destination. It was the source. And the people involved didn't need to panic, because everything was planned. The storage, the quiet cleanup, the rental car used later not for escape, but for secondary transport. Perhaps something had to be moved after the initial plan failed. Perhaps the buyer was delayed, and the operation's timeline slipped. That would explain why, weeks later, cadaver scent was found in the boot of a car hired 24 days after the disappearance. Was something stored for later? Was a final delivery made under cover of night? These questions aren't answered by headlines. They're hidden in the logistics. And the more you understand how organ trafficking works, the more the puzzle pieces begin to suggest a medically driven operation, not a crime of passion or impulse. And then there's the ultimate possibility. Was Madeleine selected before the trip even began? If she had been identified as a potential match, via informal screening, visual health assessments, or even prior medical access, then the trip to Praia da Luz wasn't a vacation. It was a window. A chance to isolate the child, control the environment, ensure no external witnesses, and use professional credentials to shield any unusual activity under the guise of medicine, parenting, or stress. There are documents indicating that David Payne, for example, made medical arrangements during the trip, a doctor making calls to a UK hospital. Nothing illegal, but unusual. Was it related to a patient, or to a transfer? We don't know, because medical privacy is powerful, protected. Even in police investigations, certain files can be withheld under the guise of professional confidentiality. And in this case, both Payne and McCann knew exactly how to navigate that legal terrain. So the trail goes cold. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because it was never left behind. There are no bloody footprints when the ones walking wear surgical covers. There are no fingerprints when gloves are standard practice. There is no panic when precision is the plan. In the end, if Madeleine was selected, it wasn't because she was vulnerable. It was because someone made her valuable. And the tragedy isn't just that she was lost. It's that she may have been used by the very people who should have protected her most. This was never just a missing child case. It was a system failure wearing the mask of tragedy. From the moment Madeleine McCann disappeared, the world was told to look outward. A shadowy figure in the night, an open window, a fleeting silhouette on a narrow Portuguese street. But everything we've uncovered points not outward, but inward. Not to chaos, but to control. Let's trace the trail backward. A 3-year-old vanishes. There are no signs of forced entry, no credible witnesses, no DNA from strangers. But cadaver scent is found inside the apartment, on her toys, behind the couch in the wardrobe, and weeks later, in the trunk of a rental car. The apartment fridge is replaced with no record, no explanation. The original disappears. The parents are both doctors, so is their close friend. The group continues to eat dinner together, drink wine, and smile for cameras days after the loss. Gerry McCann is seen playing tennis. Kate McCann, according to friends, had previously expressed being overwhelmed by Madeleine, enough to consider sending her away. A fund is launched, but not a charity, a company. Donations flow in, and instead of being used solely for searches, they're spent on lawyers, PR agents, mortgage payments, and defamation suits. Yvonne Martin, a registered social worker, recognizes David Payne from a previous child protection case, but her report is brushed aside. The police files from Leicestershire, the region where both Payne and McCann worked, vanish. FOI requests return blank. And finally, a deeper suspicion emerges. That what happened wasn't the result of panic, but planning. That Madelein's body wasn't hidden, it was used. A theory begins to take shape. That a highly compatible child, surrounded by people with medical access and anatomical expertise, was selected, perhaps not randomly, but surgically. The equipment, the cold storage, the silence, all of it paints a picture not of violence, but of procedure. And when the plan faltered, when the buyer was late, or the transport delayed, the cleanup began. A rental car, a freezer that didn't belong, a missing record, and a media machine so powerful, so carefully built, that even the Portuguese investigators who saw through the illusion were discredited, demoted, or sued. Goncalo Amaral, the original lead detective, said it plainly in his book. She died in the apartment. His theory was that the death was accidental, covered up by a panicked family. But even he may not have seen the full machinery moving behind the curtain. Because once you stop looking for a child and start asking where the organs went, everything shifts. And here's the hardest truth of all. Madeleine McCann will never be found. Not because no one is looking, but because there is nothing left to find. If she was hurt, transported, and used, then no search will ever succeed. There is no sighting to wait for, no breakthrough to hope for, because what was left of her was erased, divided, and delivered somewhere far from Praia da Luz, long before the headlines even began. And yet, the myth persists. Because it's safer to believe in kidnappers, in strangers, in monsters outside. It's unbearable to accept that the real monster may have been inside the apartment the whole time. Worse still, that he may have smiled on the balcony the next day. Worse than that the system might have known and said nothing. What does justice look like when the crime is not just a disappearance, but an entire apparatus of silence? When police delete files? When governments offer PR instead of prosecution? When news networks ask softball questions and never follow up on their own findings? What remains is not truth. It's not even memory. It's a narrative, polished, protected, profitable. The world moved on. The fund grew quiet. The media softened its tone. And yet, the evidence remains. In archived reports, in deleted files, in bloodstains under the floorboards, and in the memory of a child who was never lost, but taken apart piece by piece. This isn't a call for anger. It's a call for clarity. Because if what we've laid out is even half true, then we don't need a new search party. We need a new investigation. Not led by PR consultants. Not built around the comfort of public sympathy, but driven by forensic logic, uncomfortable questions, and a willingness to stare into the dark places polite society refuses to go. This story isn't about one family. It's about a system where status shields suspicion, where the right profession buys silence, where grief can be manufactured and the truth redacted. In the end, we ask not just where Madeleine is, we ask, what was she worth? To someone rich enough, desperate enough, or powerful enough to make her vanish without a trace. And if that answer is too awful to imagine, then imagine this. A child dies. Her body is processed. Her story is rewritten, and the world applauds the tragedy, never realizing it was surgery, not sorrow. If we can't speak that truth, if we're too polite to ask, if the media won't press, if the courts won't dare, then the question becomes final. If everyone stays silent, who will speak for her?